The evening was unusually calm, the kind of quiet that settles over a small town when the rush of the day has faded, and all that remains is the slow rhythm of life. Imagine yourself sitting in a wooden chair on a front porch, somewhere in a forgotten corner of the American countryside. The crickets are singing in the background, a soft, steady hum that feels almost like a lullaby. The old houses along the road stand still, their windows dimly glowing with the last traces of lamplight. It is in moments like these that the past begins to whisper, gently, steadily, almost like a memory too faded to grasp fully, yet too heavy to ignore. History is rarely made of battles and kings alone. It lingers in the worn-out shoes of workers who walked dusty roads, in the faint scratches on wooden fences left by restless children, in the faded ink of forgotten letters stored in attics. It is the slow, ordinary passing of time, recorded not in grand declarations, but in the unremarkable, repetitive routines of human life. Tonight, we travel back, not to the grand stages of history, but to the ordinary spaces where the weight of centuries still rests quietly. Imagine a family in the late 1700s, not wealthy, not poor, but suspended somewhere in between, living on the outskirts of a newly growing American settlement. Their small wooden house creaked with every gust of wind. The fire in the hearth never burned too bright. Wood was precious, carefully measured. The father rose before dawn, his boots pulling through mud, his breath visible in the crisp morning air as he walked toward the fields. The mother, meanwhile, stitched clothing by the flicker of a candle, her hands steady, her eyes tired. Around them, life carried on without spectacle. Yet, these unnoticed days formed the very foundation of a nation's survival. Long before factories roared and cities sprawled, the people of these young settlements lived in rhythms dictated by seasons. Winters were long, harsh, and unforgiving. The snow blanketed the earth in silence, pressing against the walls of cabins until it seemed that even sound itself could not escape. Families huddled close, listening to the crackle of firewood, telling stories that blurred fact with imagination, because storytelling was one of the only luxuries they had. In the summer, the same families worked under the relentless sun. Their skin darkened, their backs bent, planting, harvesting, storing, always working not for wealth, but simply to survive. What makes this story particularly dull, and yet strangely comforting, is that it lacks drama. No great battles shake the earth here. No famous names enter the scene. Instead, we find ourselves with nameless settlers, living their days in cycles so predictable that the details blur together. One day looked like the next. A child feeding chickens at sunrise. A mother boiling the same pot of soup stretched with more water than ingredients. A father repairing tools, his hands cracked and rough, repeating the same task for the 100th time. And yet, though unremarkable, this monotony is precisely where the true texture of life rests. Think of the roads they traveled. They were not wide boulevards or paved streets, but narrow dirt paths lined with stones and weeds. Wagons creaked over them, carrying little more than sacks of grain or bundles of cloth. Horses trudged slowly, their hooves sinking into the earth after rainfall. The air often smelled of smoke and soil, sometimes of manure, sometimes of freshly cut hay. In the evenings, when the work was done, people did not gather in theaters or grand halls, but on wooden stools outside their doors, watching the sunset as if it were their only entertainment. And often it was. Their lives were not free from fear, though. Illness lurked constantly. A simple fever could take away a child. A cough could become a death sentence. There were no hospitals in the modern sense, only neighbors offering herbs or whispered prayers. Death was a quiet companion, always near, always possible, but rarely dramatic. It came slowly, like the fading of a candle, and life moved on. Graves were dug, names carved onto wood or stone, and the days continued. Yet in this unending repetition, something remarkable begins to emerge: the persistence of human endurance. These settlers, these forgotten figures of history, carried on without applause, without recognition, simply because life demanded it. Their small, unnoticed choices: what seeds to plant, how much food to save for winter, when to mend a fence, shaped the slow growth of communities that would one day expand into towns and eventually into cities. But in this first step of our long story, we must linger here, in the slowness, in the quiet. We must pause to imagine the crackle of a hearth fire in a cabin with one room, where children slept on straw mattresses, their dreams broken by the sound of the wind pushing against wooden walls. We must picture the steady rhythm of a hand guiding a needle through rough fabric, creating garments that would be worn until they fell apart. We must listen to the heavy silence of a night, broken only by the sound of distant wolves, or the faint creak of wood settling in the cold. This is boring history, not because it is meaningless, but because it resists drama. It is the history of waiting, of working, of repeating, of enduring. It is the story of countless people who lived entire lives without leaving a mark in any book, but whose daily labor built the foundations on which the more famous events of history rested. So, let us settle into this rhythm. Let the story move slowly, as life itself once did. There is no rush, no climax waiting just around the corner. Only the passing of days, the turning of seasons, the endless repetition of work and rest, of hunger and survival. This is where history begins, not with shouts, but with silence. Not with heroes, but with ordinary lives carried out in ordinary times. And in this stillness, if you listen closely enough, you may feel the weight of centuries pressing down, reminding you that history is not only what excites us, but also what lulls us into quiet reflection. Morning comes quietly in these forgotten towns, almost shyly, as if the sun itself knows not to disturb the slowness of the world it touches. The first light filters through thin curtains of rough linen, falling across wooden floors that creak at the slightest step. Roosters crow, not urgently, not in chorus, but in scattered voices, echoing from one homestead to another. The air is cold, carrying the dampness of dew, and the smell of earth drifts in through small gaps in the walls of the cabin. The father rises first, always the same way, as though pulled by duty rather than desire. He pulls on the same worn boots, ties the same rough string around his coat, and steps outside into the pale light of dawn. The fields await him, rows of soil darkened from rain, stubborn stones that must be lifted, weeds that creep back no matter how many times they are pulled. His hands are already cracked from yesterday's work, but he bends down once more, patient and wordless. Inside, the mother wakes to the soft rustle of blankets as children stir. She does not linger in bed. There is no luxury for that. The fire from last night has long since died, and she must coax it back to life, blowing gently on embers, arranging small twigs, then larger pieces of wood until the flame catches. A pot of water is set above it, the promise of porridge that is never thick enough, never filling enough, but enough to keep the family standing. The rhythm is the same each morning, measured, predictable, almost mechanical. The children rub their eyes, their hair messy, their small faces still carrying sleep. They do not complain. Complaint has no place here. They dress in clothes already patched and repatched, fabric thinned from years of use. Shoes are often shared between siblings, or passed down until the soles nearly fall apart. Their day begins not with play, but with tasks: carrying water from the well, gathering eggs, sweeping dirt floors, feeding animals. Work is introduced to them early, not out of cruelty, but because survival demands it. Step outside, and the soundscape is sparse: a distant axe splitting wood, a dog barking at nothing in particular, the clop of hooves as a neighbor passes with a cart full of hay. Life here is not silent, but it is slow, deliberate, without rush. Time does not race, it stretches. Days feel longer not because of leisure, but because of their heaviness, the sheer weight of labor that fills every hour. Meals are small, often the same. A piece of bread hardened from yesterday. Porridge thin and bland, made thicker only on good days when more grain is available. Meat is rare, reserved for special occasions or when hunting is fortunate. The family eats without chatter, their focus on consuming what is necessary. There is no variety, no spice, no indulgence, just sustenance, enough to keep the body moving through the endless work ahead. After eating, the father remains in the fields. The mother tends to the home, her hands never idle. She sews, she stirs, she washes, she scolds, she comforts. The children scatter to their duties, though sometimes their eyes wander to the horizon, where forests stretch endlessly and rivers gleam faintly under the sun. Their imaginations drift beyond the narrow borders of the farm, but soon the pull of necessity brings them back. A fence must be fixed. Chickens must be guarded from foxes. The dream of escape fades quickly into the reality of chores. The town itself is nothing more than a collection of modest houses, each with smoke rising lazily from its chimney. A dirt road runs through it, not bustling, not crowded, just enough to connect one home to another. Occasionally, someone passes with a wagon, wheels creaking, horses snorting, and neighbors exchange small nods. Conversations are brief. The weather's turning colder. The soil looks dry this year. Did you hear wolves last night? Words serve their function, but nothing more. Gossip and chatter are luxuries. Here, people conserve their voices as carefully as they conserve food. Evenings are predictable, too. The father returns, shoulders heavy, clothes dirt-stained, hands aching. The children gather near the hearth, the only source of warmth in a house where winter drafts always find their way inside. Supper is eaten quickly, and then comes the only variation in the day: quiet storytelling. No books, no grand tales, just simple retellings of family history or local rumors reshaped into something resembling myth. A story about a neighbor who once saw lights flickering in the forest. A memory of a great storm that flattened half the crops one summer. A warning about the dangers of wandering too far from home. And when the stories end, the silence returns. Outside, the night presses close. Stars scatter across the sky, brighter than modern eyes ever see. But to those living here, they are not spectacular. They are simply there, constant and unmoving. Wolves howl in the distance, their voices carrying through the trees, but the people do not fear them too much anymore. Fear is not useful. Precautions are: a locked door, a watchful dog, a fire kept burning just a little longer. As the family drifts to sleep, the repetition of their existence continues, unbroken and unremarkable. Tomorrow will look like today. The day after will mirror both. And in this sameness, time itself becomes heavy. Generations live and die in this cycle. And yet, history books rarely record their names. This is the true texture of boring history. The endless, unchanging details of survival. No kings, no generals, no revolutions here. Just the long hum of life carried out by countless ordinary souls, each day blending into the next, like waves that leave no trace on the shore. And if you listen carefully, you can almost hear it now. The scrape of a hoe in the field, the sigh of a tired mother by the fire, the slow turning of seasons in silence. It is a history without drama, and yet it is the ground on which everything else stands. The rhythm of life in the settlement does not change suddenly. It shifts slowly, like the turning of seasons. By the time autumn arrives, the air feels heavier, carrying with it the scent of damp leaves and the promise of colder days. Fields that once grew tall with grain stand nearly empty now, their stalks cut low, leaving behind stubble that crunches under boots. The harvest is complete, though it never feels like enough. Wagons creak under the weight of corn and wheat, barrels filled with apples and potatoes, all stored carefully in cellars and barns. These stores are not abundance, they are simply hope, measured out in piles and sacks, destined to stretch across the long winter. Families walk through the fields after harvest, inspecting what is left. A missed ear of corn here, a forgotten pumpkin there. Nothing is wasted. Children are sent to collect what remains, their small fingers quick to pick what adults overlooked. Even the husks, the stalks, the scraps. Everything has its purpose. The animals are fed what humans cannot eat. Firewood is stacked higher each day, logs carefully arranged near cabins where the cold will bite hardest. Life is not about comfort. It is about preparing enough to endure the months when the world outside turns hostile. The work is steady, monotonous. Men mend fences, check roofs, sharpen tools for the next year. Women spend long hours boiling fruits into preserves, drying herbs, salting meat when it is available. The air inside cabins grows thick with the smells of cooking. Apples simmering, onions drying, the faint sharpness of vinegar used for pickling. But despite the scent, meals remain small. What is preserved must last. To eat generously now is to starve later. Children continue their small duties. Though with the colder air, their games become rarer. They are pulled inside sooner, kept busy with simpler tasks, carding wool, twisting yarn, sorting beans. At night, they huddle near the hearth, where flames flicker and shadows stretch across the walls. The heat never quite reaches the corners of the room. Cold drafts creep in through cracks, so blankets are shared and bodies pressed together for warmth. The cabin feels smaller in winter, the air heavy with smoke, the hours slower than ever. The settlement as a whole grows quieter. Fewer wagons move along the dirt roads. Neighbors see one another less often, their visits limited by weather and necessity. Yet, on rare occasions, a gathering is called, a barn raising, a communal butchering, or a shared harvest feast. These moments are not loud or extravagant, but they carry a weight of togetherness. Long tables are arranged from planks of wood. Food is laid out sparingly but with care, and the sound of laughter, though muted, rises in contrast to the usual silence. For a night, people remember they are not alone in their work. And then, just as quickly, life returns to its steady rhythm of repetition. Illness, however, lingers always in the background. With colder weather, coughs spread easily, fevers rise in the night, and mothers sit awake, pressing damp cloths to the foreheads of children, whispering quiet prayers. Sometimes the illness passes, leaving only weakness. Sometimes it does not. The burial ground, a small clearing at the edge of the forest, receives new names each season. Graves are marked simply. Wooden crosses, a few carved letters if someone has the time and skill. Mourning is short, not from lack of love, but from the demands of survival. Life cannot stop for grief. The fields still need tending. The fires still need feeding. Tears are shed, prayers whispered, but the work goes on. The nights grow longer. Candles are burned sparingly, their wax too precious to waste. Families often sit in near darkness, the firelight their only illumination. Shadows dance along walls, making the cabin feel alive in strange ways. Time stretches, each night blending into the next, each morning arriving without surprise. Outside, the wind howls across empty fields, rattling shutters, seeping through walls. Wolves wander closer, their tracks found near barns, their eyes glowing faintly when caught by moonlight. The danger is real, but not constant. It is another presence, another reminder that survival is always fragile. The monotony is broken only by the turning of the seasons themselves. Winter presses harder, and with it, the weight of scarcity. Meals grow thinner. A loaf of bread must last longer. Potatoes are counted carefully. Apples inspected daily to see which will spoil first. Children ask for more, but mothers shake their heads. Hunger becomes familiar, not dramatic, not sudden, but steady. A dull ache that follows everyone into sleep and greets them again in the morning. And yet, life continues. Seeds are set aside for the spring. Tools are hung with care. Stories are told once more by the fire. These stories are not grand legends. They are fragments of memory. A grandfather recalling the time a river froze solid enough to walk across. A neighbor describing the sound of locusts that once devoured a field in hours. A child repeating a tale of strange lights in the woods, passed down from someone long gone. Stories keep minds awake when bodies are tired. They fill the silence. They pass the hours. They remind each listener that others before them endured the same. As the months pass, the sameness grows heavier. Each day feels like a reflection of the last. Yet within this repetition, there is also resilience. Families learn to live within the limits of what they have. They endure loss without collapsing. They face hunger without despairing. Their lives are not celebrated in history books, but their persistence is the quiet force that allows generations to continue. Step outside one last time on a late winter night. The air is so cold it burns your lungs. The snow crunches beneath your boots. The world's silent, except for the groan of trees bending under ice. Look at the sky. It is vast, black, endless, filled with stars so sharp they feel like they could cut the night itself. For a moment, you understand the stillness of this place, the weight of these lives. History is not rushing here. It is crawling slowly, day after day, in the repetition of work, hunger, survival, and endurance. And when morning comes again, nothing has changed. The father will rise, the mother will stir the fire, the children will wake to chores. The cycle begins anew, as it always has, and as it always will, until seasons turn and generations pass quietly into memory. This is the essence of boring history. Not empty, not meaningless, but steady, patient, and unremarkable. It is the story of survival in silence, the kind of history that is forgotten precisely because it happened every day. For spring does not arrive suddenly in these settlements. It comes like a whisper, slowly loosening winter's grip, melting snow into muddy streams, softening the frozen ground just enough for life to stir again. The first signs are small, a bird call returning after months of silence, thin shoots of green pressing through the damp soil, the faint smell of thawing earth. Families notice these changes not with celebration, but with relief. Winter, with its hunger and endless nights, has passed. Yet spring is not easy. It brings work. More work than the body feels ready for after months of cold. The men return to the fields, bending their backs once more, turning the heavy soil with crude tools. Their arms ache from swinging hoes and guiding plows, often pulled not by horses, but by their own strength when animals are scarce. Every seed planted is an act of hope, yet also of worry. Too much rain could rot the soil. Too little could wither it. Pests could strip plants bare overnight. Every season is a gamble, and the stakes are survival itself. The women busy themselves with tasks that feel endless. Clothes must be washed in the streams, hands raw from the cold water. New garments must be stitched for growing children, patched again and again until the fabric itself gives way. Herbs are gathered, dried, and stored. Chickens must be tended, goats milked, gardens planted with vegetables. There is no pause, no quiet moment to rest. Even when seated, the women's hands move constantly, sewing, peeling, grinding. Work is the air they breathe. Children find themselves caught between duty and curiosity. The thawed streams are tempting, their waters rushing fast, carrying twigs and leaves away. The woods, alive again with birds and animals, call to them with mystery. But chores remain their anchor. Buckets of water must be carried, tools fetched, seeds dropped into soil with careful fingers. A child's laugh may echo through the fields for a moment, but it is soon swallowed by the sound of labor, the steady scrape of hoes, the thud of boots against earth. The town itself seems to stretch after winter. Neighbors see one another again, not just at burials or rare feasts, but in the fields and roads. Conversations remain sparse, but there is a different tone now, a cautious optimism. Someone comments on the soil looking rich this year. Another shares a small success with early planting. Yet these words carry no guarantee. Everyone has lived long enough to know that spring's promise can vanish in an instant, replaced by drought, flood, or blight. Hope here is fragile, like the new leaves just beginning to unfold. As the days grow longer, life settles back into its rhythm of repetition. Morning begins with the same rooster's crow, the same stretch of aching muscles, the same thin porridge swallowed before work. Afternoons pass under the weight of the sun, bodies bent low, sweat stinging eyes. Evenings bring only enough time to mend tools, eat a small meal, and collapse into sleep. And yet, despite the sameness, people endure. Their endurance is not dramatic. It is quiet, steady, the kind that history rarely remembers. Occasionally, the monotony is broken by small events that ripple through the settlement. A traveling peddler arrives, his cart filled with trinkets, fabrics, or tools. Children gather first, their eyes wide at the sight of bright colors, shiny objects, unfamiliar smells. Adults approach cautiously, measuring what little they have against what they might need. A new knife, a length of cloth, a tin pot. Each item feels both luxurious and necessary. Coins are scarce, so barter is common. Eggs, wool, or a jar of preserved fruit traded for something that might make daily life slightly easier. After the peddler leaves, the settlement returns to its silence. But for a few days, conversations linger about what was bought, or what could not be afforded. Religion also fills the space of monotony, not with grandeur, but with quiet ritual. Once a week, families gather in a simple wooden structure or even in someone's barn. There are no grand choirs, no stained glass, only rough benches and a voice leading prayers. Hymns rise softly, sung not for beauty, but for comfort. The words remind them that suffering has meaning, that endurance is a virtue, that patience will be rewarded. Whether or not they believe it fully, the rhythm of these gatherings provides structure, a moment to step outside the endless cycle of labor and hunger. But even spring cannot erase hardship. Illness still comes, sometimes in waves. Children cough through the night, fevers rise, old men grow weaker. Midwives are called, herbs brewed, prayers whispered, but remedies are few. A sudden sickness can sweep through a household, leaving silence in its wake. Funerals are small, often nothing more than a few neighbors gathering in the fields, bowing their heads as another grave is dug. Grief here does not echo loudly. It seeps quietly into the soil, joining countless other losses that lie beneath. The land itself shapes everything. When rains fall steadily, there is gratitude. When they come too heavily, there is fear of floods. When they do not come at all, the soil cracks, plants wilt, and despair settles over the settlement like dust. People look to the sky constantly, reading it like a book, searching for signs of what tomorrow will bring. Their lives are bound to forces they cannot control, forces that pay no mind to their struggles. And yet, still, they plant, they weed, they harvest, because there is no other choice. Evenings in spring carry a different sound. Frogs call from marshes, insects hum, birds sing long into the twilight. Families sit outside after supper, watching the horizon fade from gold to gray. The air smells of soil, damp wood, and smoke. Conversations are few, but silence itself feels softer now, less threatening than in winter. The stars appear slowly, one by one, until the sky is crowded with them. Yet for the people below, the stars are not mysteries to ponder. They are background, as steady and unchanging as the work waiting in the fields tomorrow. And so, spring passes into summer, not with drama, but with the same slow turning of time that governs everything here. Crops grow, weeds return, tools wear down, hands ache. Children become older, not suddenly, but through countless days of the same work. Parents age too, their hair graying, their backs bending lower, though the work does not lessen. Generations overlap quietly, one blending into the next, each living the same cycle of planting, harvesting, storing, and surviving. This is history as it truly was for most people. Unnoticed, uneventful, endlessly repetitive. No great wars touch these fields. No famous names are written here. What remains is the slow, steady endurance of ordinary lives, lived in silence, bound to the land, and carried forward not by glory, but by persistence. And when night falls once again, when the fields grow dark and the cabins glow faintly with firelight, the story continues as it always has, with the hum of insects, the crackle of a hearth, the quiet murmur of voices fading into sleep. Another day has passed, nearly identical to the one before, and nearly identical to the one that will follow. This is boring history, drawn out not to excite, but to remind us that most of human life was spent in these cycles, invisible, forgotten, yet forming the very fabric on which everything else rests. Summer settles over the settlement not with sudden brightness, but with a slow, steady thickening of the air. The days stretch longer, the sun rising early and refusing to leave until well past the time when bodies ache for rest. Heat lingers in every corner, pressing down on the cabins, the fields, the roads. The soil hardens beneath the relentless sun, and every step sends dust rising, clinging to skin, filling lungs, coating clothes. The work that once felt heavy in spring now feels unending in summer. Yet no one can stop. Crops demand attention, and animals still need tending. The fields stand tall, rows of corn reaching upward, stalks rustling in the breeze that never quite cools the skin. Wheat sways in slow waves, bending and straightening as if breathing. To an outsider, the sight might seem beautiful, even peaceful. To those who live here, it is simply work measured in weeks, in harvests, in the cycle of planting and reaping. Each stalk must be guarded from pests, each row inspected for signs of failure. The bounty of the season does not bring ease. It brings more responsibility, more labor, more worry. Men rise before dawn to beat the heat, their hands gripping tools worn smooth from years of use. They bend low over the soil, sweat dripping into the earth, shirts clinging to their backs before the sun has even fully climbed. By midday, the heat is punishing, and yet the work continues. There are no choices, only tasks. Bodies burn with exhaustion, but the soil does not care, and the crops do not wait. Women endure the same season differently, but no less heavily. The heat inside the cabin is stifling, yet fires must still be lit for cooking. The air grows thick with steam as pots boil and jars are sealed, preserving what can be saved for the colder months. Fruits are dried, vegetables salted, herbs hung from beams to cure in the warm air. The smell of vinegar, smoke, and sweat mixes into a constant haze. Children complain of the heat, but complaints are silenced quickly. Hands are put to work, shelling peas, carrying water, sweeping dust from floors that will never truly be clean. The days are filled with sound. Insects hum endlessly, their buzzing a backdrop that cannot be escaped. Birds cry out, swooping over fields in search of food. From the barns come the restless noises of animals swatting flies, stamping hooves against wooden floors. Even the wind carries a different tone in summer, a dry whistle through tall grass, rattling leaves that are brittle from heat. Conversations remain brief, overshadowed by the constant hum of labor and the weight of the season. Water becomes precious. Streams run lower, their flow reduced to trickles, their banks cracked with dryness. Children are sent with buckets again and again, walking carefully to avoid spilling even a drop. Wells groan when the rope is lowered, their depths yielding water slowly, grudgingly. Each sip is measured, each drop saved. Thirst becomes a companion, not desperate, but persistent. A dryness in the mouth that never fully fades. Nights offer some relief, but never enough. Families sit outside as the sun finally dips, watching the horizon glow red and then fade into gray. The air cools slightly, insects growing louder in the darkness, frogs croaking from distant marshes. Stars scatter across the sky, sharp and bright, yet unremarkable to those too tired to look long. Sleep comes in fits, bodies restless on straw mattresses, sweat sticking to skin. The heat does not leave with the sun. It lingers, pressing into every breath. Occasionally, storms roll in. The sky darkens, clouds heavy and swollen. Winds rise, rattling shutters, bending trees. Rain lashes the earth, soaking fields, flooding paths, turning dust to thick mud. Thunder rumbles, lightning cracks across the sky, and for a few hours the world feels alive, chaotic, unpredictable. Families watch from inside, the sound of rain on roofs loud enough to drown thought. For a time, the storm feels like a break in monotony. But when it passes, the work resumes. Fields must be checked, damage repaired, animals accounted for. Even chaos becomes routine. Illness does not vanish in summer. The heat itself brings sickness, stomach fevers, infections from wounds that fester in sweat and dirt. Children grow weak, their bodies failing quietly in the background of daily life. Some recover, some do not. Graves are dug in soil that is hard from sun or muddy from rain, and life continues with little pause. Morning is quiet, the silence of one fewer voice at the table, one fewer set of hands at work. The settlement itself feels almost timeless in these months. The same dust rises, the same tools strike, the same sweat falls into the soil. Generations come and go, but the rhythm does not change. Children grow older, learning the same motions their parents learned. Parents grow weaker, their bodies wearing down even as the tasks remain the same. The seasons turn, but the pattern holds. On rare evenings, neighbors gather after work is done. There is little to share, perhaps a jug of cider, a loaf of bread, a pot of stew stretched thin, but the gathering itself feels like an event. Laughter rises, though softly, never in abundance. A fiddle may be played, its notes simple and slow, filling the summer night with a brief sense of something different. Children chase fireflies, their small hands glowing with captured light for a moment before it escapes again. For a night, the monotony is softened, though never broken. And then the cycle continues. The sun rises again, earlier than the body wants. The fields wait, the cabins wait, the work waits. Summer does not rush. It lingers, stretching time until each day feels endless. But slowly, inevitably, the season begins to shift. The air cools slightly. Leaves at the edges of the forest take on hints of gold. Harvest approaches once more. This is the slow march of history. Not battles, not kings, but days lived in repetition. Heat and dust, sweat and hunger, storms and silence. Nothing grand, nothing dramatic, yet everything essential. For without these nameless lives, enduring each summer in the same cycle, there would be no history at all. And as night falls once again, the insects hum, the fire burns low, and the settlement settles back into silence, preparing to wake to another day that will look almost exactly the same as the one before. This is boring history, not to excite, but to remind. The weight of time rests not in sudden events, but in the endless repetition of ordinary lives. Autumn comes not as a sudden arrival, but as a slow shifting, almost unnoticeable at first. The air cools in the evenings, the sunlight softens, and the edge of the forest shows the earliest hints of change. Leaves lose their deep summer green and begin to fade into muted shades of gold and brown. The settlement feels the difference not in beauty, but in labor. This is the season of harvest, of gathering, of preparing for the long months when the earth will sleep and give nothing back. The fields, heavy with crops, stand like silent demands waiting to be met. Corn stalks tower above the workers, their husks rattling in the breeze, wheat waves in dull gold, heads bending under their own weight. Pumpkins, squash, and beans crowd the ground in quiet abundance. What looks plentiful is only potential. Each ear of corn, each grain, each vegetable must be cut, carried, stored, preserved. The fields do not clear themselves. Every step requires hands, and every hand grows tired. From sunrise until the last gray light of evening, the settlement works. Men swing sickles in steady, repetitive arcs, the blades whispering through stalks. Women bend low, gathering vegetables into baskets, their backs aching with each motion. Children carry loads too heavy for them, stumbling, struggling, but never excused. The rhythm of harvest is unbroken, day after day, week after week. No one speaks of rest. Rest is not an option when survival is measured in how much can be stored before the first frost. The barns swell with what has been gathered. Corn is stripped and hung, wheat is threshed, beans are dried. The air grows thick with dust, the smell of earth and straw and smoke mixing into a constant haze. Inside cabins, jars line shelves, filled with pickled vegetables, salted meats, dried fruits. Fires burn longer, kettles boiling endlessly. The sound of lids sealing and knives chopping becomes a kind of autumn song. Preservation is as much work as harvesting, and each day bleeds into the next. The weather itself adds weight to the season. Mornings grow colder, the ground damp with dew that chills bare feet. Breath becomes visible, small white clouds rising in the air. Afternoons remain warm, but the warmth feels temporary, fleeting, slipping away as soon as the sun lowers. Evenings bring wind that rustles through drying leaves, a sound that is both comforting and foreboding. The world is preparing for change, and the people must prepare with it. Not everything survives the season. Crops spoil, food rots before it can be stored. Rats and insects steal what has been earned, their presence constant and frustrating. Some families gather more than others. Some gather less. The difference is not always effort, but chance. Whether storms hit one field harder than another, whether illness took hands away from labor. In this small settlement, such differences echo. Those with abundance must share, but even sharing has limits. Hunger, though not immediate, lurks in the distance, waiting for winter. Amid the endless work, the world around still moves. Leaves fall in slow spirals, covering paths and roofs. The forest grows quieter as birds migrate, their calls fading into silence. Squirrels dart across branches, gathering acorns with frantic energy, their small bodies mirroring the labor of the settlement. At night, the sky sharpens, stars glittering cold and clear, the moon casting silver across fields stripped bare. Autumn has a beauty, but beauty here is noticed only in passing. Survival leaves little room for admiration. Communal life continues with its steady rhythm. Neighbors gather at times, helping one another with the heaviest loads, lifting, binding, carrying. The work is shared not from kindness alone, but from necessity. No one family can face the season entirely alone. Evenings sometimes bring small gatherings, simple meals stretched thin, songs hummed low to break the silence. The fiddle may play again, its sound drifting across the fields, carrying into the crisp night air. Yet even in these moments, laughter is quiet, never free, always shadowed by the work that waits at dawn. Illness returns as the season shifts. The chill of mornings brings coughs that linger. Children grow pale, their energy drained by endless labor and thin meals. Wounds from work fester more easily in the damp air, infections spreading quickly. Graves are dug in the earth, which is softer now than it will be in winter. Each loss is quiet, acknowledged in silence, marked only by the absence that follows. Life moves forward because it must. As the harvest nears its end, attention shifts to preparing for cold. Woodpiles grow taller, stacked neatly against cabin walls. Every spare hand is sent to the forest to gather more. Axes ring out, splitting logs that will burn through the months when fields lie empty. The smell of fresh cut wood fills the air, mixing with smoke that drifts constantly from chimneys. Inside, repairs are made. Patches to walls, blankets mended, holes stuffed with straw. Every task is aimed at survival, every thought on the months ahead. When the first frost comes, it is both feared and expected. The ground hardens, the air bites, and breath grows heavier. Frost coats windows, fields glisten white at dawn. By then, the work of harvest must be done, or what remains will be lost. Families look at their stores, counting silently, measuring what might last. Some feel relief, others feel dread. None escape the weight of winter pressing forward. Yet, for all its hardship, autumn also carries a strange sense of completion. The endless days of summer labor fade into the structured urgency of harvest. The cycle is familiar, unchanging. The people who live through it know nothing else. Each year repeats the same demands, the same struggles, the same silences. Generations pass, but the pattern holds. History remembers the great events, the wars, the rulers, the discoveries. But beneath those stories are seasons like these, quiet, repetitive, endured by countless unnamed lives. The true fabric of history is not woven from battles, but from harvests, from winters survived, from days of labor and nights of silence. Autumn is only one thread, but without it, the pattern could not exist. As the last leaves fall and the fields stand bare, the settlement prepares itself for the stillness to come. The air grows colder each night, fires burn longer, and the world outside turns slowly toward winter. Inside cabins, families huddle together, their breath visible in the cold air, their silence heavy. They wait, knowing that what they have gathered must now sustain them through months where nothing new will grow. This is autumn in the settlement. Not glorious, not tragic, but steady, necessary, unremarkable. This is boring history, the quiet survival that underlies all else. Winter does not arrive in one sudden storm. It creeps in slowly, pressing itself into the air, into the soil, into the lungs of those who live through it. The first hints come with frost on the edges of windows, with mornings where water left outside forms a thin film of ice. Then the ground hardens, the fields turn gray, and the forest grows silent. The earth closes itself, keeping whatever warmth it has deep below the surface. Above, everything waits. Snow begins as scattered flakes, soft and almost playful as they drift down. But soon the flakes gather, building layer upon layer, covering the fields, the cabins, the barns. Paths disappear, fences vanish, and the land is made uniform, smoothed under white silence. What was once familiar becomes hidden. The roads are no longer roads. The markers of distance are erased. Everything is blank, and in that blankness, movement slows. Life within the settlement shrinks to the space inside each cabin. Fires burn constantly, their smoke rising in steady gray lines into the white sky. Wood is fed into flames without pause. The pile outside, once tall, shrinks faster than expected. Hands that chopped and stacked in autumn now feed the fire in winter, each log disappearing into embers. Warmth is never permanent. The moment the fire fades, the cold returns, seeping into walls, into beds, into bones. Food is measured carefully. What was gathered in autumn becomes winter's currency. Jars are opened sparingly, meat cut into smaller portions, bread baked in thinner loaves. Meals are plain, repetitive. The taste does not matter, only that the body continues to function. Hunger is never fully absent. It lingers, dull and constant, reminding each person that the supplies, no matter how carefully guarded, will not last forever. Illness thrives in this season. The air inside cabins is thick, heavy with smoke, damp with breath. Coughs echo in the night. Fever burns in the skin, and the weak grow weaker. There are no medicines beyond herbs, no treatments beyond rest, and rest itself is scarce. When one falls ill, the cabin becomes quieter. Every movement slower, the air heavier. Sometimes the illness passes, sometimes it does not. Graves dug in frozen ground are shallow, the earth resisting even in death. Silence dominates winter. The forest is muted, the rivers frozen, the animals hidden away. Outside, footsteps crunch on snow, the sound sharp and lonely. Inside, the crackle of fire and the murmur of voices are the only signs of life. Children grow restless, trapped in small spaces, their energy bottled, their laughter subdued. Adults speak less, their words measured, their voices low. Time itself feels different. Days blur together, weeks indistinguishable, marked only by the dwindling of supplies and the shifting of weather. Storms arrive without warning. Winds rise, howling across empty fields, rattling cabin walls. Snow piles high against doors. Windows disappear beneath drifts. For days, the settlement may be cut off, each family enclosed in its own silent world. Fires burn higher, food runs lower, and patience thins. When the storm passes, the world outside is unrecognizable again. Paths erased, landmarks buried. Life continues, but only with effort, only with constant adjustment. There are moments of stillness that feel almost beautiful. Nights when the moonlight reflects off the snow, turning the world silver. Mornings when frost clings to every branch, every roof, sparkling as the sun rises. But beauty in winter is fragile. It does not feed hunger, it does not heal illness, it does not ease cold. It is noticed, then forgotten, overshadowed by the weight of survival. Community endures, though often in silence. Families sometimes gather in one cabin, combining warmth, sharing food, singing quiet songs to push back the heaviness. Stories are told, not for entertainment, but for endurance, each word a thread that ties one night to the next. The sound of a fiddle may rise again, soft and slow, a reminder that life exists even in the coldest season. But even these moments are restrained. Laughter is brief, smiles fleeting. The weight of winter presses on every gesture. The animals suffer too. Livestock huddle in barns, their breath steaming in the cold air. Food for them is measured as carefully as for people, every handful of hay counted. Chickens grow thin, cows give less milk, and some animals do not survive the season. Each loss is felt. Each animal gone is less food for the months ahead, less strength for the fields when spring returns. Winter teaches patience in the harshest way. There is no rushing it, no bargaining with it, It will last as long as it lasts, indifferent to hunger, to illness, to human endurance. The people within the settlement can only wait, watching their supplies shrink, their bodies weaken, their spirits dull. Some count the days, others stop counting altogether. When the snow begins to melt, it does so slowly, almost reluctantly. The first patches of brown earth appear like revelations, small islands in a sea of white. Water drips from roofs, paths re-emerge, rivers crack and flow again. The air shifts, carrying the faintest hint of warmth. Winter loosens its grip, though never all at once. Even in retreat, it leaves behind its mark, on bodies, on minds, on the settlement itself. This is winter, long, slow, quiet, repetitive. Nothing dramatic, nothing heroic. Only the dull weight of survival carried day after day, month after month. It is not the history told in books, but it is the history lived by countless lives. It is the thread between seasons, the space where time drags, where survival itself becomes the story. And when it ends, it does not end with celebration. It ends with relief, with exhaustion, with the quiet acknowledgement that one more winter has been endured. The fire burns lower, the woodpile is gone, the shelves are nearly bare. Yet the people remain, and in remaining, they carry history forward, not with triumph, but with persistence. This is boring history, the history that lies beneath all others. Winter, endured in silence, shaping lives that no one will remember. Spring does not rush. It comes slowly, almost grudgingly, as though reluctant to replace the grip of winter. The snow begins to retreat in patches, small circles of earth appearing near cabin walls where the sun lingers the longest. These patches grow day by day until the white blanket weakens, softens, collapses into mud. Rivers, silent and frozen for months, crack and shatter, their waters running brown with thawed earth. The forest stirs, its silence broken by the faintest rustle of life. The settlement greets spring not with joy, but with relief mixed with unease. The winter has stripped away strength. Bodies are thin, faces pale, energy scarce. Food stores sit nearly empty, shelves lined with nothing but dust where jars once stood. The woodpile is gone, fires burn weaker, and clothes hang in tatters. Yet still, the people have endured. Endurance, however, is not triumph. Survival has left them tired, heavy with the memory of what has been lost. Work begins immediately. Fields that lay buried beneath snow are revealed as sodden stretches of mud. The soil must be turned, drained, readied for planting. Tools, worn dull from the year before, are brought out again. Plows creak against the earth, guided by hands blistered and stiff from cold. Every furrow carved into the ground is both a promise and a demand. The earth gives nothing freely. It must be coaxed, broken, shaped to yield again. Seeds, saved carefully through the winter, are handled like treasures. Each one carries weight. Each one must be placed with care, pressed into soil with hope that it will take root. Corn, wheat, beans, vegetables, each seed is not just food for the year to come, but survival for those who plant them. Planting is steady, repetitive, quiet work. Rows stretch across the fields, filled with the memory of years past and the expectation of years ahead. The thaw brings water in abundance, too much at times. Floods sweep across low fields, washing away early plantings. Cabins leak, roofs sag under the strain of melting snow. The mud clings to boots, to tools, to everything. The air is damp, heavy with the smell of wet earth, smoke, and decay. The season of renewal is also the season of rot, and every step outside sinks into it. Livestock emerge weak from their winter confinement. Cows, thin from scarce hay, stumble into fields that hold no grass yet. Chickens, ragged and restless, scratch at bare earth. Pigs wander, ribs visible beneath their hides. They must be fed, but feed is short. Until the grass grows again, until crops take hold. Both animals and people live on the edge of hunger. Spring is not an escape from hardship, but a continuation of it, wearing a softer mask. Illness lingers into the new season. The damp air carries fevers and chills. Children, weakened by the winter, cough and wheeze. Mothers bury infants who did not survive the long, cold months, the graves marked quietly, without ceremony. Spring's first warmth does not erase winter's losses. Instead, it reveals them more clearly, as though the light uncovers what the darkness had hidden. Despite this, there are moments that suggest possibility. Buds swell on trees, small leaves unfurl. Birds return, their calls sharp in the morning air, breaking months of silence. Frogs croak from streams. Insects hum faintly as they emerge from hidden places. The world stirs, restless, alive. For brief moments, the settlement notices. Children chase each other through muddy fields, their laughter short but bright. Adults pause, squinting toward the greening horizon, saying little but feeling the shift. The rhythm of spring is labor. Fields must be planted, fences repaired, cabins patched. Wood must be gathered anew. Though the urgency of warmth is less pressing now, fishing begins again. The rivers swollen and restless. Nets are cast, lines drawn, the catch thin at first but growing as waters clear. The forest offers early herbs and berries, small gifts that add variety to meager meals. Every task is essential. Every hour spent with hands in soil, on tools, on nets, social life reemerges as cabins open their doors. Neighbors call to one another across fields, their voices carrying in the damp air. Work is often shared, one family helping another with planting, tools passed back and forth, strength combined where it is weakest. Evenings sometimes bring gatherings again, though quieter than in summer, less abundant than in autumn. A fiddle may play, a song may be sung, but always the air is heavier than the notes. Spring is not yet celebration, it is preparation. The settlement understands that spring is a threshold. What is done now will decide the months ahead. Too little planted, too much lost, too slow to act. And hunger will return with winter's cold. Each family watches their field with wary eyes, measuring each row, counting each seedling, waiting for the first signs of growth. Hope is not spoken aloud, but it hangs over every furrow of soil, every sprout that pushes its way toward the light. The days grow longer, the nights shorter. The air warms, carrying scents of grass, flowers, earth. The settlement moves with the rhythm of light, rising earlier, working later, bodies slowly regaining strength under the sun. The memory of winter does not vanish, but it fades enough to allow motion, enough to let the cycle continue. This is spring, not a sudden rebirth, not a miracle, but a slow reawakening. It is the turning of mud into soil, of seeds into plants, of silence into sound. It is hardship transformed into labor, loss transformed into preparation. It is not the history remembered in books or marked on calendars, but it is the history lived in every year, in every settlement, by countless lives that will never be named. Spring does not end with triumph. It ends with planting finished, with fields lined in neat rows, with the hope, never guaranteed, that growth will follow. It ends with hands blistered, backs bent, and faces turned toward the uncertain months ahead. This is boring history, the quiet, repetitive endurance that carries life forward from one season to the next. Summer returns not as a surprise, but as a slow accumulation of warmth. The air grows heavier, days stretch longer, and the fields begin to shift from pale green to deeper, richer shades. The settlement feels the change, not as relief, but as responsibility. What was planted in spring now demands attention. Each row of corn rises higher. Beans climb their poles. Wheat sways with the faintest breeze. The quiet of winter and the mud of spring give way to labor measured in heat, in sweat, in hours stretched across the sun. The sun rises early, spilling light into cabins before sleep is finished. Work begins with the dawn, bodies moving before words are spoken. Tools wait where they were left, handles worn smooth by hands that hold them day after day. The soil, once wet and stubborn, now dries under constant light. Dust rises with each step, clinging to clothes, to hair, to skin. The smell of earth is no longer damp but dry, mixed with the sharp scent of sweat. Weeds grow as quickly as crops. They push through soil, tangling with seedlings, stealing light, stealing space. Hours are spent pulling them, bending low, fingers digging at roots. The task repeats endlessly, for weeds return as soon as they are gone. Children join in, their small hands clumsy, their voices fading into silence as the day stretches on. Each row cleared is temporary, each row still waiting a reminder of work unfinished. The sun bears down, unrelenting. Heat settles into every surface, the ground, the tools, the cabins, the very air. Breath comes heavy. Sweat soaks through clothing. Skin burns under constant exposure. Water is fetched from rivers and wells, carried in buckets that seem always too small. Drinking brings brief relief, but thirst returns quickly. Shade is scarce, and even where trees stand, the air remains thick. Rest is rare, stolen in moments, and always ended before comfort can settle. Crops demand water as much as people do. Rain falls, sometimes too much, sometimes not enough. Storms sweep across fields, flattening stalks, tearing leaves, undoing weeks of labor in a single night. Other days bring nothing but sun, the soil cracking, the plants wilting, the future of harvest hanging on clouds that never arrive. The balance between abundance and hunger is fragile, dictated by skies that give no explanations. Livestock press through the heat as well. Cows stand in rivers, their bodies half submerged, flicking their tails against flies that swarm without end. Chickens pant, wings lifted, their movements sluggish. Pigs roll in mud, coating themselves to cool the skin beneath. Even animals bred for labor and survival show their weakness under the weight of summer. Their health matters as much as the crops, for without them, the settlement falters. Illness returns in new forms. Heat brings fevers, water carries sickness. Insects spread disease. Children grow weak from sun and labor, their bodies thin, their skin burned. Adults push past exhaustion, but fatigue settles deep, heavy in their bones. A misstep in the fields, a tool cutting skin, a wound untreated, all small things that can swell into loss. Graves do not stop in summer. They only change what fills them. Yet amid the endless work, life stirs with small signs of continuity. Nights bring a different rhythm. After the sun sinks, the air cools just enough to allow breath. Families sit outside cabins, their bodies too weary for talk, but unwilling to retreat indoors. Fireflies drift through the air, their faint light pulsing against the dark. The sound of frogs and insects fills the silence left by human voices. Sometimes, faint music rises again, the fiddle pulled from its corner, its strings humming softly. The notes are not joyous, but they are steady, and in steadiness there is comfort. The forest, once silent in winter, now bursts with sound. Birds call from every branch, their songs sharp and constant. Small animals scurry through undergrowth, their movements hidden but never absent. At night, larger creatures stir, wolves, foxes, deer, shapes moving in shadows just beyond firelight. The settlement exists within this larger life, never apart from it, never fully secure against it. As weeks pass, the crops grow taller, thicker, fuller. Corn stalks rise above heads, beans climb into tangles of green, wheat fields shimmer gold beneath the sun. The work does not lessen, but its purpose becomes visible. Each row planted in spring now holds the weight of survival. Each stalk and each grain is both the product of labor and the promise of endurance. Families walk through their fields, eyes scanning for damage, hands brushing against leaves, calculating silently what the future holds. The days blur together. Work begins at dawn, ends at dusk, repeats without pause. Meals are simple, eaten quickly, often in silence. Sleep comes heavy but short, broken by heat, by insects, by the sounds of animals stirring outside. Weeks pass with little change, marked only by the growth of crops and the slow turning of time. Life is not measured in events, but in tasks completed, rows cleared, buckets carried. Summer is both abundance and burden. It is the season when the land offers the most, but only through constant labor. The people endure, not with celebration, but with persistence. Their bodies bend to the cycle of the sun, their days stretched thin by necessity. Each season carries its own weight, and summer's is heat, repetition, and exhaustion. When storms come, they arrive with violence. Thunder cracks across the sky, lightning splits the dark, and rain falls in sheets that blur the fields into rivers. Wind tears through cabins, rattling shutters, lifting roofs. The work of months can be undone in hours. Crops flattened, soil washed away. Yet when storms pass, work begins again. Plants are lifted, soil repaired, losses measured. There is no choice but to continue. Summer draws on longer than expected. The heat lingers. The labor does not end. The days seem endless. Yet slowly, almost imperceptibly, the air begins to change. Nights cool more quickly. Mornings carry a hint of dampness. Leaves on the edges of the forest deepen in color. The cycle turns again, as it always does, carrying the settlement toward autumn. This is summer in the settlement, not filled with triumph, not marked by leisure, but heavy with labor, with repetition, with the constant demand of survival. It is boring history, the kind lived quietly, endured daily, remembered by no one but shaping everything. And as the first cool winds stir through the fields, the people know what comes next. Summer does not end with celebration. It ends with exhaustion, with fields heavy and waiting, with the quiet knowledge that the cycle of harvest will begin again. The years following the close of the 19th century brought a period of profound transformation for the United States, one that touched every corner of society, from the bustling cities filled with factories and immigrant workers, to the quiet rural towns still clinging to older rhythms of life. It was an age when optimism about progress and industry was frequently tempered by the harsh realities of inequality, labor struggles, and the strains of modernization. The story of this period is not merely one of economic growth and expansion, but of the countless ordinary lives that stitched the nation together, often in silence and struggle, away from the triumphant headlines of wealth and achievement. Factories belched smoke into the skies of places like Pittsburgh, Chicago, and New York. The skyline itself seemed to change with each passing year, as steel frame buildings began climbing higher than ever before, creating what we now call skyscrapers. Yet, for the countless men and women who labored within those factories, life was far from glamorous. The clang of machinery filled their ears for hours on end, shifts that often stretched beyond 12 hours, with barely enough pay to keep food on the table. Children as young as 8 or 9 were sent to work in textile mills, their small fingers darting between threads, their backs bent under the relentless pressure of quotas. Laws meant to protect them existed on paper, but were loosely enforced, leaving families with little choice but to endure. Out in the countryside, life moved at a different pace, though not necessarily with less hardship. Farmers continued their battles against unpredictable weather, fluctuating crop prices, and the seemingly unending dominance of railroads that controlled the rates for shipping their harvests. Many farmers joined movements like the Populist Party, hoping to gain a voice against the powers of industrial monopolies and financial institutions. Though their efforts would eventually fade into the larger tides of politics, they reflected the deep frustration of those who felt left behind in the new industrial era. At the same time, immigration was reshaping the very fabric of American cities. Ships from Europe arrived daily, docking at Ellis Island or Boston Harbor, their passengers carrying little more than hope for a better life. Italians, Poles, Russians, Irish, Germans, and countless others poured into the cities, settling into crowded neighborhoods where dozens of families might share a single tenement building. The air in those neighborhoods was thick with the aromas of home-cooked meals from across the world, mingling with the less pleasant sense of inadequate sewage systems and overcrowded streets. Life was precarious, but these communities found ways to adapt, building networks of support, churches, mutual aid societies, and cultural centers that kept traditions alive while they learned the rhythms of their new homeland. Social reformers saw the struggles of the working poor and tried to intervene. Settlement houses, such as Jane Addams's Hull House in Chicago, became centers where immigrant families could learn English, receive basic health care, or send their children to classes. Addams and others like her became voices of conscience, reminding wealthier Americans that progress was not measured solely in steel production or railroad mileage, but in the lives of ordinary people. Yet reform was slow and often resisted by business interests that valued profits above all else. Meanwhile, the rise of trusts and monopolies stirred a national debate about fairness and democracy itself. Companies like Standard Oil, controlled by John D. Rockefeller, had grown so massive that they seemed untouchable, swallowing competitors and manipulating markets at will. Critics warned that democracy could not survive if economic power was concentrated in the hands of a few. The government began to act, albeit cautiously, with laws like the Sherman Antitrust Act. But enforcement was inconsistent, and it would take years before significant steps were made to dismantle the trusts that many believed threatened the country's future. Amid these economic and social tensions, cultural life was also shifting. Cities became hubs not just of commerce, but of entertainment. Vaudeville theaters, with their mix of comedy, music, and novelty acts, attracted audiences seeking relief from their daily struggles. Baseball, once a casual pastime, grew into a professional sport, with figures like Honus Wagner and Cy Young capturing public imagination. For ordinary people, these diversions provided moments of escape, a chance to forget about crowded tenements or grueling labor, if only for a few hours. Politics, too, reflected the changing mood of the country. Leaders like Theodore Roosevelt emerged, embodying a spirit of reform and progressivism. Roosevelt's energy was boundless, his belief in the square deal, promising fairness for workers, consumers, and businesses alike. He took on the trusts, pushed for conservation of natural lands, and expanded the role of government in ways that reshaped the presidency itself. For many Americans, he symbolized a break from the complacency of the Gilded Age. a leader willing to challenge the entrenched powers of wealth and privilege. Even as the United States grappled with its internal challenges, it also looked outward, expanding its presence on the global stage. The Spanish-American War had already thrust the nation into a new role as an emerging power, with territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines falling under American control. This shift raised uncomfortable questions. Was the United States living up to its ideals of liberty and self-determination, or was it simply becoming another empire? Debates raged across the country as voices of anti-imperialism clashed with those who saw expansion as both destiny and necessity. In the quieter corners of the nation, far from the grand debates and political movements, life went on in its own steady way. Families gathered on porches in the evenings, telling stories or listening to the crackle of a new invention, the phonograph. Children played stickball in alleys, their laughter echoing through brick walls. Traveling salesmen made their rounds in small towns, carrying with them the goods of a rapidly modernizing world. Sewing machines, canned food, and the latest patent medicines that promised cures for nearly every ailment. It was a time when the extraordinary and the ordinary coexisted side by side, when the hum of modernity blended with the traditions of the past. But beneath the surface of this period of rapid change, tensions continued to simmer. Racial inequality remained entrenched, particularly in the South, where Jim Crow laws codified segregation and denied African Americans even the most basic rights of citizenship. Lynchings were a brutal reminder of the violence that underpinned this system, terrorizing communities and silencing voices of dissent. Yet, even in the face of such oppression, resilience grew. Black newspapers, churches, and leaders like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois laid the groundwork for future struggles, insisting that the promises of the nation's founding documents applied to all, not just a privileged few. As the first decade of the new century unfolded, the United States stood at a crossroads. It was a nation bursting with energy and ambition, yet shadowed by inequities and contradictions. Its people worked, dreamed, and endured, shaping a society that was anything but simple. Their stories were not always recorded in the grand annals of history, but in their labor, their resilience, and their hopes. They formed the quiet backbone of a country learning what it meant to be modern, to be powerful, and above all, to be democratic. The period was one of paradox, optimism and struggle, progress and injustice, triumph and quiet suffering. And in that paradox, one sees the true character of the American experience, not defined solely by its great leaders or its battles, but by the countless lives lived in its streets, factories and fields, each contributing, often unknowingly, to the unfolding story of a nation still in the making. The rhythm of daily life in the early 20th century continued with relentless persistence, shaped by the demands of work, the seasons, and the ever-shifting economy. Cities grew taller and denser, a tangle of streets, tenements, factories, and markets where people from every corner of the world mingled, clashed, and struggled to survive. For the majority, life was measured not in headlines or historical milestones, but in labor, meals, and the small, almost imperceptible changes that accumulated over years. Each day repeated the last with slight variations, a subtle progression that defined generations. Children who had been sent to factories in the 1890s were now older, their young hands hardened by years of threading looms, handling machinery, or carrying heavy loads. Their bodies were marked by work, calloused, bent, sometimes scarred, yet their minds and ambitions remained alive in quiet, hidden ways. They learned to read in evening classes, to add numbers for accounting work, to sew, to fix broken machinery. Skills that seemed trivial in the moment were the tools that would allow them to survive, to rise, or at least to endure. School attendance remained irregular. Often, necessity outweighed education, and the balance between learning and earning was delicate and tense. Factory life itself continued to expand. Machines roared louder, the pace of production quickened, and the expectation of efficiency became all-consuming. In steel mills, workers bent under heat and pressure, sparks flying with every strike of hammer or press. The air was thick with soot, dust, and smoke, settling into lungs, clothing, hair, and eyes. Injuries were frequent, minor and major alike, but accepted as the cost of earning a wage. Each paycheck, small as it was vital. Rent, food, clothing, and medicine depended on it. For families living hand-to-mouth, the difference between a day missed and a day worked could be disastrous. Rural communities, meanwhile, continued their struggle with the land. Even as mechanization began to creep into farms, plows drawn by steam or early tractors, the dependence on weather remained absolute. Droughts, floods, and early frosts could destroy a season's work in days. Farmers watched the skies and the soil with constant vigilance, tracking rain patterns, observing the clouds, noting temperature shifts. Markets demanded consistency and reliability, yet nature gave neither. Every successful harvest was both a relief and a fleeting achievement, a temporary pause before the next cycle of planting, tending, and reaping began. The cities and the countryside were connected, though unevenly. Railroads carried goods and crops, coal and steel, textiles and machinery, linking urban centers to rural producers. The railroads themselves were powerful institutions, dictating shipping costs and routes, wielding influence over commerce and politics alike. Farmers and small producers often found themselves at the mercy of railroad monopolies. Their profits diminished not by their own inefficiency, but by the rates set in distant offices. Discontent simmered in quiet conversations, letters home and meetings at local halls, where neighbors discussed strategies for cooperation and resistance, forming the seeds of movements that would later shape national policy. Immigration remained a defining feature of urban life. New arrivals filled streets, shops, factories, and homes with languages, customs, and cuisines. Italians, Poles, Jews, Greeks, and others brought their traditions, blending and sometimes clashing with those of earlier settlers. Tenement life was crowded, unsanitary, and fraught with the challenges of survival. But it was also a place of community. Families shared what little they had: meals, advice, childcare. Neighborhood networks provided protection, support, and the continuation of cultural identity in an unfamiliar world. Church bells rang for weddings, funerals, and gatherings, marking the rhythm of life amidst chaos. Labor movements intensified during this period. Workers increasingly recognized that individual effort was insufficient to negotiate fair conditions. Strikes, both large and small, erupted across industries. Men and women walked off their posts, demanding safer workplaces, shorter hours, and higher pay. Police often responded with force, employers with lockouts, and courts with indifference. Yet persistence paid off in some instances. The visibility of organized labor grew, unions gained traction, and slowly, small improvements, safety measures, wage increases, recognition of collective bargaining became a reality for some. For those in isolated or unorganized sectors, however, struggle continued unabated. Daily life unchanged, but for the constant presence of hope and fear. At the same time, technology transformed the texture of life. Electric lights extended working hours, allowed for new patterns of activity, and illuminated streets previously dark and dangerous. Telephones began to connect homes to cities, factories to offices, families to distant relatives. Cars, still rare, hinted at the mobility and speed that would dominate the decades to come. Even as technology promised progress, it also demanded adaptation, expense, and attention. Another layer of labor added to the already full lives of ordinary people. Society also faced persistent inequalities. Racial segregation in the South remained enforced by law, and discrimination in the North existed socially and economically, limiting opportunities and confining lives. Women, though active in reform movements and social organizations, still faced legal and cultural restrictions. The struggle for suffrage, rights, and recognition was ongoing, and victories were slow, incremental, often requiring years of persistent effort. Yet, even in hardship, incremental changes accumulated, leaving traces that would shape future generations. Everyday life was filled with repetition and endurance. Meals were prepared with care but limited ingredients. Clothing was mended, patched, and reused. Tools were sharpened and repaired, and work continued even when exhaustion pressed into bones. Children ran errands, helped in factories, and learned the rhythm of labor from their parents. Nights were quiet, not because of choice, but because energy had been spent. Sleep came heavy and often brief, a necessity rather than comfort. In towns and cities, entertainment existed in small doses. Picture shows, vaudeville, and local fairs provided temporary respite. People gathered, laughed quietly, and for moments, the monotony lifted. Yet these diversions were brief, fleeting interruptions in lives dominated by survival, labor, and preparation for the next day. The extraordinary moments were infrequent, the routine perpetual. History in this period was often recorded as the story of leaders, innovators, and political movements. But the lives that truly shaped the nation were those of ordinary men, women, and children who endured daily hardship without recognition. They carried the rhythm of society forward, sustained communities, and ensured continuity even when circumstances were unforgiving. The nation's growth depended not only on industrial expansion, political reform, or territorial acquisitions, but on these countless unremarkable lives, living, working, suffering, and persisting. This slow accumulation of experience, the daily triumphs and defeats of ordinary existence, constituted the real fabric of life. The headlines captured events, wars, and elections, but the true pulse of history beat in quiet homes, crowded streets, and expansive fields. It persisted in the small victories of survival. A harvest preserved, a wage earned, a child sent to school, a family kept together despite poverty or disease. These were the quiet measures of life that shaped the human landscape, and they unfolded endlessly, day by day, season by season. Summer's heat, repetitive labor, and small victories blended into memory. As fields ripened and work pressed on, families continued the cycles their ancestors had known. Planting, tending, harvesting, storing, feeding, surviving. Time moved forward without pause, leaving behind only traces of human persistence, small changes, and incremental growth. The ordinary lives of ordinary people, unnoticed by most, formed the continuous thread of existence, holding society together through moments of both progress and stagnation. And so, life continued, a rhythm of effort and endurance, punctuated occasionally by minor celebrations, small losses, and persistent hope. Each day mirrored the one before in its demands, its tasks, and its quiet perseverance. This was the true, boring history of ordinary people. The undercurrent beneath industrial triumphs, political reforms, and technological advances. The lives that endured, persisted, and wove the fabric of a nation with quiet, unrelenting diligence. By the time the second decade of the 20th century was underway, the world had already begun to shift in ways both subtle and profound. Cities stretched taller, factories multiplied, and transportation networks, railroads, streetcars, and early automobiles threaded the nation together with increasing density. Yet, for the majority of ordinary people, these changes did not bring sudden comfort or dramatic transformation. Instead, life remained defined by cycles of work, endurance, and survival, punctuated by the slow accumulation of small improvements or occasional setbacks. The rhythm of daily life, though altered by technology and industrial growth, retained a constant monotony, the kind that defines what is sometimes called boring history. In the cities, tenement life continued in crowded and precarious conditions. Families lived packed into apartments where one room often served as kitchen, bedroom, and living space. Water came from shared pumps or faucets. Waste flowed into open gutters or basic sewer systems that overflowed in rainstorms. Illness lingered in these environments, with tuberculosis, influenza, and other diseases claiming lives silently and efficiently. Parents labored long hours in factories or workshops, leaving children to navigate streets and schools with a mixture of caution, ingenuity, and fatigue. The days were repetitive, their pressures relentless, and the victories measured not in wealth or comfort, but simply in the continuation of life, from dawn to dusk. Factories themselves had become more sophisticated, yet no less demanding. Assembly lines introduced by innovators like Henry Ford promised efficiency, but for workers, efficiency meant a pace that consumed attention, energy, and often health. Each day, men and women repeated the same motions, tightening bolts, running machinery, monitoring production without pause. The work was exhausting, the environment noisy and dangerous. Accidents were common. Injuries were endured because stopping meant losing wages, and wages were essential to survival. The monotony of labor was punctuated by the rare moment when a worker paused to observe the world beyond the factory floor. A glance at the skyline, a distant train, or the light slipping through a dusty window. In rural areas, the agricultural cycle pressed onward. Farmers prepared for planting as the frost receded, plowed fields with teams of horses or early tractors, and spread seeds with careful, patient hands. Crops demanded constant attention, water, protection from pests, and constant monitoring for disease. Farmers tracked the weather with obsessive attention, noting the slightest changes in wind, temperature, and humidity. Each planting season carried risk. A sudden drought, a storm, or a pest infestation could undo weeks of labor. Yet the rhythm persisted. Each generation passed knowledge to the next. When to plant, when to harvest, how to preserve, how to survive. The work was endless and cyclical, the rewards often modest but vital. Social inequality remained a defining reality. Immigrant communities continued to arrive, seeking opportunity, yet encountering discrimination and overcrowding. Their labor fueled industrial growth, yet their living conditions were often harsh and unforgiving. Racial inequality persisted as a deep, structured reality in much of the nation. Jim Crow laws in the South codified segregation, while discrimination in the North limited economic mobility and confined communities to marginal neighborhoods. Women, still denied full suffrage in many states, worked both in domestic roles and increasingly in industrial positions, balancing paid labor with the responsibility of raising children and managing households. The burden of survival was uneven, and those who carried it were often invisible to the narratives of power and progress dominating the era. Labor movements grew steadily, fueled by frustration and a growing awareness of collective strength. Strikes became more common and organized, sometimes successful, sometimes brutally suppressed. Efforts to unionize were met with resistance from both employers and government forces, yet the persistence of workers slowly shaped regulations and awareness. Small victories, a reduction in hours, an increase in pay, improved safety measures accumulated over years, often unnoticed outside the communities directly affected. Ordinary lives were changed incrementally, a process invisible in the grand sweep of history, but monumental in the experience of those who lived it. The influence of technology continued to expand. Electric lighting transformed homes, streets, and workplaces, altering daily rhythms and extending the hours available for work or study. The telephone connected families and businesses over long distances, yet many could afford only limited access. Automobiles and streetcars began to change patterns of mobility, but the benefits were unevenly distributed. Rural families remained tied to horses and wagons for much of their transportation needs. Cities became increasingly congested, with traffic, noise, and pollution as constant companions. Technology offered both progress and new burdens, reshaping the texture of daily existence without relieving the fundamental pressures of survival. Education slowly became more widespread. Though attendance was inconsistent and often interrupted by economic necessity, children learned basic reading, writing, and arithmetic, but many also learned trades, practical skills, and the informal lessons of endurance. Schools were often crowded and underfunded, yet they provided one of the few opportunities for children to glimpse a world beyond immediate labor. For immigrants and the children of immigrants, education was a bridge to opportunity. Though it remained fragile and contingent on family resources, community support, and health. Health remained a quiet concern. Public sanitation improved gradually, yet disease continued to claim lives. Influenza outbreaks, typhoid, and tuberculosis persisted, particularly among urban poor. Rural areas faced different challenges. Crop failures, accidents, and limited access to medical care shaped daily life in ways that demanded resilience and patience. Individuals relied on knowledge passed down through families, folk remedies, and local healers, blending old practices with new medical insights. Yet much of survival was pragmatic: food, warmth, rest, and careful attention to the environment. Even as society evolved, the monotony of daily work and survival persisted. Meals were simple and repetitive. Clothing was patched and mended rather than replaced. Tools, furniture, and homes required constant repair. Time was measured in labor, rest, and seasonal change. Entertainment existed but was limited. Vaudeville shows, traveling circuses, or community fairs offered temporary relief. But these were rare and fleeting, moments that punctuated the endless cycles of work. Stories, songs, and rituals preserved culture and community, embedding memory and identity into the repetitive structure of life. The slow accumulation of incremental changes, labor victories, technological improvements, educational opportunities, slight health gains, shaped the trajectory of society without dramatically altering the lived experience of the majority. Ordinary lives were defined not by extraordinary events, but by endurance, adaptation, and subtle progress. This boring history underpinned the more visible narratives of political and economic change, ensuring continuity even amidst upheaval. As seasons passed, the cycle of labor and survival repeated predictably. Planting, tending, harvesting, storing, repairing, feeding, enduring. Children grew, learned, and joined the labor force. Adults aged, adapted, and persisted. Families maintained cohesion where possible, adjusting to loss, illness, and the relentless pressures of daily existence. Time moved forward in increments that were often imperceptible, yet cumulatively transformative. This was the real substance of life, the slow, steady endurance of ordinary people through ordinary years, shaping society not in dramatic leaps, but in the quiet persistence that made every other historical event possible. Every harvest gathered, every wage earned, every life sustained contributed to the continuity of communities, cities, and the nation. And so, life pressed on. Each day mirrored the last in its work, fatigue and minor triumphs. Yet the accumulation of these ordinary days formed the true history of the era, a history rarely recorded, often ignored, but essential to the unfolding story of the United States and the countless people who shaped it without recognition. The years pressed forward into the early 1920s, a period of quiet yet steady transformation in the lives of ordinary Americans. The cities hummed with the persistent rhythm of industry, factories expanding, streets crowded with workers, merchants, and vehicles, streets filled with the clatter of streetcars, the shouts of vendors, and the occasional honk of a car horn. The density of life made every day feel long, both physically and mentally, yet each day followed the same familiar pattern: work, labor, meals, and rest. The monotony was constant, yet within it lay the subtle evolution of modern society. Tenement life remained a defining reality in urban centers. Families continued to share cramped apartments, the walls thin enough to carry every cough, cry, and argument. Water and sanitation were improved in some neighborhoods, yet in others, gutters overflowed, and disease spread quietly through the population. Children balanced school with work, often delivering goods, running errands, or taking temporary positions in local workshops. Play existed, but it was confined to alleys, empty lots, or short recesses in school. Joy, when it appeared, was brief and fragile. Adults labored long hours in factories, printing houses, and sweatshops, each day leaving them tired, sweat-streaked, and aching, yet still necessary to sustain their households. Factories had grown larger and more mechanized. Assembly lines ran with increasing efficiency, demanding continuous attention and unbroken rhythm from their operators. Each task was repetitive: tightening a bolt, stamping a part, operating a press, counting and packaging items. The air remained thick with smoke, dust, and the metallic smell of machinery. Accidents continued to be common, and while some regulations had emerged to improve safety, enforcement was inconsistent. Each paycheck, no matter how small, was vital, for food, rent, and clothing depended on it. Rural life mirrored its urban counterpart in its quiet persistence. Farms required constant attention, with planting, irrigation, and maintenance occupying nearly every available hour. Early mechanization, such as tractors and motorized equipment, had begun to reduce some physical strain, yet dependence on weather remained absolute. Droughts, floods, and pest infestations could devastate crops within days. Farmers measured time not in hours but in seasons, monitoring soil, precipitation, and the sun with meticulous care. Their labor was continuous, and their small victories, successful germination, abundant harvests, or the survival of livestock, were celebrated quietly, often in the form of simple acknowledgement or rest after weeks of toil. Technology continued its gradual transformation of everyday life. Electricity, telephones, and automobiles became increasingly common, reshaping daily routines. Streets became brighter at night, businesses extended hours, and communication over long distances became feasible. Yet, these advancements did not relieve the pressures of work. They layered additional responsibilities, requiring new skills, maintenance, and expense. Life remained repetitive, punctuated by the integration of these small, incremental improvements that, cumulatively, began to reshape social and economic expectations. The social landscape was increasingly complex. Immigration continued, though at different rates, and cultural enclaves thrived in cities. Italians, Poles, Jews, Greeks, and others maintained traditions, languages, and cuisines, creating tight-knit communities amid urban density. Neighborhood support systems, churches, clubs, and informal networks offered practical assistance for childcare, illness, and employment. These communities preserved culture and identity while navigating the demands of modern industrial society. Labor movements continued to evolve. Strikes became more organized and politically visible, advocating for safer working conditions, reduced hours, and fair wages. Union activity increased, particularly in industrial centers, yet resistance from business owners and local authorities remained strong. Gains were incremental: minor improvements in workplace safety, modest wage increases, and gradual recognition of collective bargaining rights. These small victories mattered profoundly to those whose lives they affected, yet they were easily overlooked in the broader historical narrative. Women's roles continued to shift, both in urban and rural contexts. They worked in factories, offices, schools, and homes, managing both income-generating labor and domestic responsibilities. The suffrage movement had achieved a landmark victory with the 19th Amendment in 1920, yet the practical realities of gender inequality persisted. Opportunities were limited, wages often lower, and cultural expectations heavily prescriptive. Women's daily lives remained a delicate balance of endurance, labor, and quiet negotiation of social norms. Public health improvements had made some difference, yet disease remained a constant concern. Influenza outbreaks, tuberculosis, and childhood illnesses claimed lives silently and efficiently, particularly among those in dense urban neighborhoods or rural areas with limited access to medical care. Knowledge of hygiene and prevention was increasing, yet resources and adherence varied widely, leaving many vulnerable. Life was measured in cautious attention to illness, careful monitoring of children, and the maintenance of basic sanitation within homes and communities. Education grew slowly more accessible. Public schools provided a foundation of literacy and numeracy, but economic necessity often interrupted attendance. Vocational training, night schools, and informal apprenticeship opportunities became increasingly important. Children learned practical skills to supplement traditional education, blending labor and learning in a cycle that continued throughout their formative years. The repetition of lessons, practice, and endurance mirrored the broader rhythm of life. Incremental progress measured quietly over years rather than in dramatic breakthroughs. Community rhythms remained essential. Neighbors exchanged knowledge, labor, and resources, sustaining one another through seasons of work, illness, and scarcity. Festivals, parades, and religious observances provided intermittent relief from routine, yet these moments were brief and structured, carefully timed around labor demands. The continuity of social and cultural traditions offered stability, a small form of resistance against the monotony of daily survival. Throughout this period, ordinary life was governed by a series of cycles: work, sustenance, labor, rest, and survival. Children grew into adults, adults aged, and the patterns repeated predictably, shaped by economic, environmental, and social pressures. Individual achievements mattered less than continuity, persistence, and the small successes necessary to carry life forward. Every meal preserved, every tool maintained, every child educated, and every field tended contributed to the quiet, enduring foundation of society. This is the reality of boring history, not marked by battles, political speeches, or headline-grabbing inventions, but by the everyday endurance of ordinary people. It is the slow accumulation of labor, resilience, and incremental progress. It is the repetition of seasons, the quiet observation of weather, the negotiation of urban density, the persistence of immigrant communities, the gradual improvement of social conditions, and the steady integration of new technologies into a life otherwise dominated by work and survival. In essence, the lives of ordinary Americans during this period were defined by continuity within change. Work that was repetitive yet evolving, survival that demanded attention and care, and social structures that were both rigid and adaptive. They endured heat and cold, hunger and illness, monotony and unpredictability, all while navigating the complex currents of a rapidly modernizing nation. The story of this era, therefore, is neither spectacular nor dramatic. It is the story of repetition, persistence, and the quiet accumulation of small events that, together, formed the foundation of modern life. It is the record of daily existence, ordinary people enduring ordinary challenges, shaping a nation through their continued presence and unremarkable yet essential labor. The 1920s pressed on with a mixture of subtle transformation and persistent routine. In cities, streets hummed with constant activity. Horses, streetcars, early automobiles, and pedestrians competed for space on uneven roads. Factories operated with ceaseless noise, producing textiles, machinery, and goods for a society that demanded more, faster, and cheaper. Workers endured long shifts, sometimes 12 or 14 hours, under hot and poorly ventilated conditions. Sweat and soot became a part of daily life, sticking to skin, clothes, and hair, marking labor's presence in ways both visible and invisible. Yet within this monotony, incremental changes occurred: slightly safer machinery, small wage adjustments, minor reforms, though these were often imperceptible in the moment. Tenement life remained crowded and dense. Families often lived in a single room, sharing what little space they could. Water came from shared faucets, toilets were communal, and ventilation was poor. Disease continued to linger in this environment, claiming lives quietly and unpredictably. Parents balanced work with caring for children, while children took on small jobs to contribute to family income. Play existed, but it was fleeting. A brief game in the alley, a hurried chase around a corner, a shared story before bedtime. Even leisure was measured against necessity, constrained by the pressing demands of survival. Factories had become more mechanized. Assembly lines increased production, but the speed and repetition took their toll on workers' bodies. Fingers grew calloused and bent, backs stiffened, and eyes strained from constant focus. Injuries were common, and while some regulatory improvements existed, enforcement was uneven. Each paycheck, however modest, was essential. Food, rent, clothing, and medical needs depended on it. Labor was monotonous but unavoidable, a rhythm that defined the passage of days. Rural life continued in parallel, though with different pressures. Farms required constant attention: planting, watering, tending, harvesting. Weather dictated outcomes, and unpredictability remained a constant companion. Droughts, storms, pests, or unexpected frosts could destroy weeks of labor in a single day. Livestock needed feeding, fences needed repair, equipment required maintenance, and the land demanded careful observation. Each successful harvest was both a relief and a temporary triumph. Yet the cycle began anew without pause. The rhythm of farm life was dictated by seasons and survival, leaving little space for distraction or leisure. Technology slowly infiltrated daily life. Electric lights extended hours, and telephones began connecting neighborhoods and cities. Automobiles increased mobility, though primarily for wealthier households. Rural families often relied on horses and wagons for transportation. Innovations brought convenience, but also required attention, skill, and expense. The pressure to adapt to new tools and methods added a layer of work, sometimes unnoticed, sometimes burdensome. Life's monotony persisted, though occasionally punctuated by the novelty of modern invention. Immigrant communities continued to form the backbone of urban neighborhoods. Italians, Poles, Jews, Greeks, and others brought traditions, food, and culture, blending old world customs with new world challenges. Neighborhoods supported one another, sharing childcare, offering employment tips, and providing communal spaces for worship and gatherings. These networks sustained daily life and offered resilience against the hardships of poverty, labor, and discrimination. The work of survival, however, remained unceasing. Labor movements expanded, and workers' consciousness of collective power grew. Strikes became more organized, demanding fair wages, safer working conditions, and shorter hours. Employers often resisted, sometimes with the aid of local authorities, but persistent efforts gradually yielded small victories. These changes were incremental: modest increases in pay, minor improvements in safety, recognition of union representation. For workers, these small gains mattered profoundly, though they were often invisible in historical overviews focused on grand events or leaders. Women's roles continued evolving. They labored both at home and in factories, schools, offices, or as domestic workers. The passage of the 19th Amendment granted voting rights, yet equality remained distant. Women managed household economies, child-rearing, and labor simultaneously, often unnoticed and underappreciated. Their work, repetitive and endless, formed an essential part of the social and economic structure. Public health improved gradually, though threats persisted. Tuberculosis, influenza, and other infectious diseases affected urban and rural communities alike. Limited access to medical care in both environments heightened risk. Knowledge of hygiene and sanitation increased slowly, though implementation varied. Families balanced precaution with practicality. Careful food preparation, basic cleanliness, and attention to symptoms. Survival required constant vigilance, small adjustments, and cautious planning. Education spread, but remained inconsistent. Schools provided basic literacy and numeracy, while vocational training prepared children for labor markets. Attendance was often interrupted by economic necessity. Yet even these small advances built incremental change over generations, creating opportunities for children whose parents had endured hardship without interruption. Education, like labor, was a daily, incremental effort rather than an instantaneous transformation. Cultural and community life offered brief relief. Vaudeville shows, fairs, church gatherings, and parades punctuated the monotony. Children played in alleys and fields. Adults occasionally gathered in modest social venues, and small celebrations occurred for religious or civic holidays. These moments were transient, but provided essential breaks from the unrelenting demands of work and survival. The extraordinary in life was rarely spectacular. It was woven into the repetitive, consistent effort required to continue day to day. The 1920s were an era of gradual transformation. Yet for the majority, life remained dominated by repetition, endurance, and small victories. Daily labor, seasonal cycles, and social continuity defined existence. Ordinary people, workers, farmers, immigrants, women, children, sustained communities, contributed to economic growth, and ensured the continuity of society. Their efforts were often invisible to the broader historical narrative, yet they formed the true foundation of progress. Time marched forward in cycles. Seasons dictated labor, communities maintained social structures, and families endured the challenges of illness, poverty, and environmental pressures. Every harvest, every wage earned, every child educated contributed to continuity. Life was measured in persistence, resilience, and the slow accumulation of small, incremental changes. This was the essence of boring history, the quiet endurance and persistence that shaped society without fanfare, attention, or dramatic events. As the decade progressed, people continued their routines. Work, labor, and survival remained constants. Fields were tended, streets traversed, meals prepared, tools repaired, and children raised. The rhythm was repetitive, steady, and predictable. Yet it formed the fabric of daily life, sustaining communities and linking generations. The extraordinary rested in persistence, in endurance, in the quiet work of ordinary people sustaining ordinary life. The story of this era, like the preceding decades, is not a tale of dramatic breakthroughs or sudden upheavals. It is a story of consistency, labor, incremental improvement, and the resilience of countless lives woven together in the ongoing rhythm of survival. Each day, repeated countless times, contributed to the continuity of the nation, forming the invisible backbone of history that endured long after headlines faded. And so, life continued. Long hours of work, the slow progression of seasons, small victories and inevitable losses. The rhythm persisted, quiet but unrelenting. Ordinary people endured, adapted, and maintained the continuity of society, shaping history in ways both profound and invisible, until the time came for the next chapter to unfold. As the 1920s drew to a close, the country seemed caught in a rhythm both familiar and unceasing. The cities continued to swell with population, skyscrapers punctuating the skyline as symbols of ambition and progress. Yet for ordinary people, life remained grounded in routine. Factories roared day and night, producing goods at a pace that demanded constant human labor. The clang of machinery, the hiss of steam, and the rhythmic pounding of assembly lines were the background music of urban existence. Each worker moved through the day in repetition, a series of motions honed by experience and necessity, with little recognition beyond the paycheck at day's end. Tenements still housed families in cramped, often unsanitary conditions. Water was shared, waste management inconsistent, and disease persisted quietly, claiming lives with little notice. Children balanced school attendance with work, delivering packages, assisting parents, or taking small jobs in factories or shops. Play existed in fleeting moments, sometimes a hurried game in the alley, sometimes a whispered story before bed. But survival dominated attention. Parents labored, often from dawn until dusk, their bodies marked by the accumulation of years of hard work, calloused hands, bent backs, and tired eyes that reflected both fatigue and persistence. Factories and industrial labor remained relentless. Mechanization increased output but also heightened the monotony and physical toll. Workers performed the same motions repeatedly, tightening bolts, operating presses, assembling parts, or monitoring machinery. The risk of injury remained ever present. A single misstep could mean weeks of lost wages. Or worse, the air was thick with dust, smoke, and chemical odors. Workers endured the strain because there was no alternative. Wages, however modest, were the lifeline that sustained families, purchased food, and maintained homes. The rhythm of labor defined the pace of life itself, unceasing, unglamorous, yet absolutely essential. In rural areas, life continued to revolve around the land. Fields were tilled, seeds planted, crops tended, and harvests gathered with painstaking care. Weather dictated the success or failure of the season. Droughts, floods, pests, and early frosts could undo months of labor in days. Farmers measured time through observation of the sun, the clouds, and the soil. Livestock needed feeding, fences required mending, equipment demanded repair. Each successful harvest was both relief and temporary triumph, a momentary acknowledgement that survival had been achieved, if only until the next cycle began. The rural world, though physically removed from industrial cities, mirrored their rhythm of persistent, repetitive labor and incremental survival. Technological advancements subtly changed the texture of daily life. Electricity illuminated streets and homes, telephones connected families over distance, and automobiles increased mobility for some. Yet for many, these innovations were luxuries, accessible primarily to wealthier households. Rural families relied largely on horses and wagons, while city dwellers used public transportation and walked long distances daily. Technology offered incremental convenience, but added responsibilities, requiring attention, maintenance, and cost. It did not relieve the fundamental pressures of survival, but layered new demands upon them. Immigrant communities remained integral to urban life. Italians, Poles, Jews, Greeks, and others maintained traditions and culture while navigating the challenges of industrial America. Neighborhoods formed support networks, sharing knowledge, resources, and assistance with childcare, illness, and employment. Churches, social clubs, and mutual aid societies became pillars of resilience, ensuring the survival and stability of communities under pressure. Yet the overarching rhythm remained unchanged. Work, labor, sustenance, and small moments of rest. Labor movements continued their slow evolution. Strikes and organized efforts demanded safer working conditions, fair wages, and reduced hours. Employers often resisted through force or legal mechanisms, yet small victories gradually accumulated. Some factories implemented modest safety measures. Some workers secured slightly higher wages. Unions gained incremental recognition. These achievements, though modest, shaped daily life for those directly involved, providing a measure of stability and hope in a world otherwise dominated by repetition and endurance. Women's labor and social roles remained in flux. While suffrage had expanded political rights, daily lives remained constrained by domestic responsibilities and labor market limitations. Women worked in factories, offices, schools, and homes, often juggling multiple roles simultaneously. Their contributions, though frequently invisible, sustained households, communities, and the broader economy. The passage of each day demanded continuous effort, incremental adaptation, and quiet perseverance. Public health had seen improvements, yet disease remained a constant concern. Influenza outbreaks and tuberculosis persisted, particularly in crowded urban neighborhoods or isolated rural areas. Medical knowledge grew slowly, but access remained uneven. Families employed practical measures: careful food preparation, basic sanitation, observation of symptoms, and cautious attention to illness. Survival required vigilance, patience, and incremental adjustments in daily routines. Education expanded gradually. Schools provided foundational literacy and numeracy, while vocational training prepared children for practical labor. Attendance was often inconsistent, interrupted by economic necessity or illness, but incremental gains accumulated over time. Each year of schooling built knowledge, skills, and social cohesion, contributing quietly to future opportunity and stability. Children learned to navigate both the demands of work and the expectations of education, preparing for the cyclical patterns of adult life. Entertainment and cultural life offered intermittent respite from monotony. Vaudeville shows, traveling circuses, fairs, and religious celebrations punctuated the daily rhythm, providing moments of laughter and shared experience. Children played in alleys or open lots, neighbors gathered for communal meals or prayer, and holidays offered brief interruptions in the relentless cycle of work. Yet these diversions were fleeting, carefully timed, and largely subordinate to the demands of survival. The extraordinary moments were woven quietly into the tapestry of everyday endurance. Society remained stratified. Racial inequality persisted, particularly in the South under Jim Crow laws. Discrimination existed in the North, limiting economic and social mobility. Opportunities were unevenly distributed, and progress was incremental. Women faced continued limitations despite legal advances. Poverty, labor, and health pressures disproportionately affected the most vulnerable, yet persistence, community cohesion, and small incremental improvements sustained life. The majority of people continued to exist within these structures, enduring daily challenges with resilience and adaptation. Life's continuity was the most notable feature of this era. The same cycles repeated: work, labor, meals, rest, and survival. Children matured, joined the labor force, and continued the rhythms they had learned from parents. Adults aged, adapted, and persisted. Families maintained cohesion where possible, adjusting to losses and challenges while sustaining essential routines. Daily life was repetitive, predictable, and continuous. Yet these repetitions formed the backbone of societal endurance. This boring history is the record of ordinary lives, not grand achievements or dramatic events, but the quiet, persistent accumulation of labor, endurance, and incremental progress shaped the course of society. Each day survived, each harvest gathered, each wage earned, each child educated contributed to the stability and continuity of communities and the nation as a whole. Ordinary people, largely unrecognized by historical narratives, ensured the survival and development of their families and societies. As the 1920s closed, life pressed forward in the same rhythm that had defined it for generations. Labor persisted, seasonal cycles repeated, and daily survival required continued endurance. Families endured illness, hardship, and environmental uncertainty. Communities supported one another in quiet, practical ways. Society advanced incrementally, shaped not by headlines, but by the accumulation of countless ordinary days. Ultimately, the story of this era, and indeed of ordinary history itself, is not one of spectacle or sudden transformation. It is a narrative defined by repetition, persistence, and the quiet, relentless work of ordinary people. Their lives, though often overlooked, formed the foundation of society. Each small victory, every incremental improvement, and all acts of endurance shaped the continuity of communities, cities, and the nation. And so, the decades closed not with triumphal fanfare, but with the continuation of everyday existence. Life moved forward in its steady, persistent rhythm. Work, labor, survival, endurance. Children grew, adults aged, and the cycle repeated, unchanged in essence, yet evolving subtly over time. This is the conclusion of the boring history of ordinary people. The story of countless lives lived quietly, persistently, and meaningfully, even if history seldom remembers them.